thank you for coming. I am so glad you're here. I need someone to talk to. I've been having bad thoughts. It started with this one dream. There are all these doctors and nurses. They're huddled around a gurney. But the doctors and nurses, they're gagged. And their hands are tied behind their backs like this. And then I realized I'm at an autopsy. Because on the table is the dead body of the president, President Carter. And all around the room were all these generals and admirals and FBI agents. And the president sits up on the table. He looks me right in the eye.
America does not at the moment have a functioning democracy.
And there was another man in the shadows. I couldn't make out his face, but his voice was clear.
The murder of the president is not a mystery.
But President Carter isn't murdered.
Any citizen who is willing to look can see clearly who killed President Kennedy.
When I looked back at the table, I saw that it wasn't Carter. It was President Kennedy. And the back of his head was gone. Standing behind him was a black man. He reminded me of Martin Luther King. And he reached out his hand and he said,
"The question now is, what will you do with that?"
"Do with what?" And then I woke up and I found this email on the table by my bed. Let me read it to you. Dear Seeker for Truth, please be informed. Rumors you may have heard regarding 4 tragic deaths of great men in the United States years 1963 to 68 have been false. Madmen, bad men are in the box lock, and you are safe or dead. Many lies have rumored regarding your government and leaders and secret societies made these murders for profit and to have more power for the game you play. Think impossible to fool millions of people on TV and newspapers without many secret men and offices everywhere? Learn the whole story without any money. Send to wedidn'tdo.com for internet package. Sleep well, night or day. Also learn, if you doubt us, sleep well? How can I sleep well? I can't shake this dream. I need to sort it out, but I don't know who to trust. I barely trust anyone anymore. When did it start? I tried to trust Obama, but he's not doing what he said he'd do.
Which leads to the question, why would he do all these things? Why would he be afraid, for example, to take the drones away from the CIA?
Who the hell are you?
I've come to the conclusion that he's afraid.
Who the hell are you?
That's 27-year CIA veteran analyst Ray McGovern, the man who used to personally deliver the CIA's presidential daily briefings to George Bush Sr.
Really? Or am I still dreaming?
Everything you're about to hear that isn't a narration is a quote made by the person speaking or relayed by someone who is there. Statements have been edited and reordered to help tell the story.
And I know from a good friend who was at a small dinner party with progressive supporters that they asked him, "Why don't you do the things we thought you stood for?" Obama turned sharply and said, "Don't you remember what happened to Martin Luther King?"
He said that?
That's a quote.
In the last 50 years, there have been 2 major threats to life on our planet. The first, the nuclear arms race, was narrowly averted by President John F. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy. The second, the ticking climate bomb on its short business-as-usual fuse, has no solution in sight.
That's Elizabeth Woodworth, professor and author.
If John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and Robert F. Kennedy were assassinated while promoting peace in a military economy, how far can Obama push for renewables in a military/oil economy?
So I'm pretty convinced the president is afraid of the CIA. He's got 2 small kids, and he doesn't want to get killed.
Oh, come on! He's the President of the United States!
The mystery of President Kennedy's assassination has not been solved in the mainstream press. you need to read James Douglas's book. Little plug here. JFK and the Unspeakable. And then you need to reflect on Obama.
Now wait a minute. I'm not a conspiracy theorist.
A witness of a crime who just stands by tends by that very fact to become an accomplice.
That's Thomas Merton, Trappist monk and author.
How am I an accomplice to the Kennedy assassination?
Feminist Gloria Steinem.
The truth will set you free, but first it will piss you off.
Nobody is going to force me to do anything I don't think is in the best interest of the country.
And little Kennedy, he thought he was a god.
President John F. Kennedy and Allen Dulles, director of the CIA. This is the early 1960s, and JFK is talking about the Bay of Pigs. You remember that?
Not really.
Before Kennedy became president, the CIA and military planned an attack on Cuba, together with CIA-trained Cuban exiles.
But when Kennedy came into office, he nixed the plan. Here's President Kennedy.
It will not be under any conditions an intervention in Cuba by the United States Armed Forces. We're not going to plunge into an irresponsible action just because a fanatical fringe in this country puts so-called national pride above national reason.
So then, the CIA and the military gave him a plan to have just the CIA-trained exiles land in Cuba at a place called the Bay of Pigs.
We felt that when the chips were down, any action required for success would be authorized rather than permit this enterprise to fail.
Journalist Daniel Shore.
The assumption was that the President Kennedy would be forced by public opinion to come to the aid of Cuban patriots. American forces, probably Marines, would come in.
Did the CIA and military's plan work? Did Kennedy send in troops?
They couldn't believe that a new president like me wouldn't panic and try to save his own face. Well, they had me figured all wrong.
In effect, President Kennedy was the target of a CIA covert operation that collapsed when the invasion collapsed.
But why would the CIA be carrying out a plan the president was against?
Oh well, to answer that, we have to go back to the early days of the CIA, 1948. George F. Kennan, who helped create the CIA.
We have about 50% of the world's wealth, but only 6.3% of its population. Our real task is to devise a pattern of relationships which will permit us to maintain this position of disparity without detriment to our national security. We should cease to talk about unreal objectives such as human rights, the raising of the living standards, and democratization. We are going to have to deal in straight power politics.
With National Security Council Directive 10-2 in 1947, the CIA was set up to
Propaganda, economic warfare, sabotage, anti-sabotage, demolition, subversion against hostile states, assistance to underground movements, guerrillas, and refugee liberation groups.
Fletcher Prouty was an Air Force colonel assigned to set up the Office of Special Operations in the Pentagon to provide military logistical support for the CIA's covert operations. Allen Dulles told Prouty,
I want a focal point, an office that's cleared to do what we need to have done.
We had to have contact points in the State Department, in the Treasury, in the FBI, and all through the government, up to the White House.
Here's Jim Douglas, author of JFK and the Unspeakable.
The focal point offices constituted a powerful and unseen government within the government.
conscience was criminalized as it would violate one's security oath to speak to spouse, doctor, friend, psychiatrist, clergy about any subject of work. Work was classified, secret, top secret. Daniel Ellsberg, the whistleblower who released the Pentagon Papers in the Vietnam War, had clearance 12 levels above top secret.
How many have level 12 clearance?
That's the secret.
Well, how many levels are there?
That's a secret.
And this new covert operations office had, from its beginnings, corporate partners. President Eisenhower, 3 days before John F. Kennedy was inaugurated.
This conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The military-industrial complex, the potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist.
But war has always been good for profits. Here's an example of how it worked. In the 1950s, Guatemala's elected president, Jacoby Arbenz, wanted to do agrarian reform and decrease foreign companies' influence, including the United Fruit Company, a big American corporation.
Allen Dulles and his brother, Eisenhower's Secretary of State, both had financial interests in United Fruit Company's operations. They urged the U.S. government to depose Arbenz. E. Howard Hunt, the head of the CIA's anti-Arbenz mission.
What we wanted to do was have a terror campaign to terrify Arbenz and terrify his troops, much as the German Stuka bombers terrified the populations of Holland, Belgium, and Poland at the onset of World War II.
The CIA and its public relations people talked about a Soviet beachhead in the Western Hemisphere, not about the fact that the United Fruit Company wanted to keep its resources and power in Guatemala. Arbenz was ousted in a CIA-supported coup in 1954.
Oh, no. But the CIA and the military and Kennedy too, they were just fighting communism, right? They were keeping America safe.
Safe? Here's a partial list of what the CIA was up to.
Mohammad Mosaddegh, Prime Minister of Iran, overthrown in 1953. Patrice Lumumba, Prime Minister of the Republic of Congo, assassinated in 1961.
General Rafael Trujillo, President of the Dominican Republic, assassinated in 1961. Ngo Dinh Diem, President of South Vietnam, assassinated in 1963. Francois Papadoc Duvalier, leader of Haiti, assassinated in 1971.
Okay, that's enough.
Charles de Gaulle, President of France, attempted assassination.
Charles de Gaulle?
And Che Guevara's execution.
And then there were the many attempts to oust and assassinate Fidel Castro, President of Cuba.
Castro again?
Yes, the Bay of Pigs was just one of the plans to get rid of Castro.
And there's more. In 1953, when President Eisenhower, Allen Dulles, and his brother, Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, came into office, the country had 200 nuclear weapons. In 1961, we had 20,000.
Oh my God. But what does this have to do with the Kennedy assassination?
Okay, back to Kennedy. After an investigation into what happened at the Bay of Pigs, President Kennedy fired Allen Dulles and his 2 senior deputies and cut the CIA's budget.
I want to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds.
John Siegenthaler, who worked in President Kennedy's Department of Justice under JFK's brother Robert Kennedy.
We were caught in the reality of the Cold War. The CIA had a role to play, but I don't think the Kennedys believed you could trust much of what they said. We were trying to find our way out of the Cold War, but the CIA certainly didn't want to.
So Kennedy moved responsibility for covert operations, like the Bay of Pigs, from the CIA to the Department of Defense, which he thought he could control better.
But then the military's Joint Chiefs of Staff came up with Operation Northwoods. James Bamford, author and journalist.
Operations Northwoods called for innocent people to be shot on American streets, for boats carrying refugees fleeing Cuba to be sunk on the high seas, for a wave of violent terrorism to be launched in Washington, D.C., Miami, and elsewhere. People would be framed for bombings that they did not commit. Planes would be hijacked.
Joint Chiefs of Staff?
Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Lemonster.
Such a plan would enable a buildup of incidents to camouflage the ultimate objective, overt military intervention.
In 1975, a U.S. Senate committee, the Church Committee, found that
non-attribution to the United States for covert operations was the original and principal purpose of the so-called doctrine of plausible denial. But failing to call dirty business by its rightful name may have increased the risk of dirty business being done.
Now, Thomas Merton, from his book, Raids on the Unspeakable.
The unspeakable is the void that contradicts everything that is spoken before the words are said. The void that gets into the language of public and official declarations at the very moment when they are pronounced. It makes them ring dead with the hollowness of the abyss.
The unspeakable? President Kennedy rejected the Northwoods proposal and reassigned General Lemonster.
I'll bet that pissed him off.
No, not funny. One summer weekend in 1962, while out sailing with friends, Kennedy was asked what he thought of 7 Days in May, a best-selling novel that described a military takeover in the United States. He said,
It's possible it could happen in this country, but the conditions would have to be just right. If, for example, the country had a young president and he had a Bay of Pigs, there would be a certain uneasiness. Maybe the military would do a little criticizing behind his back. But this would be written off as the usual military dissatisfaction with civilian control. Then, if there were another Bay of Pigs, the reaction of the country would be, is he too young and inexperienced? The military would almost feel that it was their patriotic obligation to stand ready to preserve the integrity of the nation. Then, if there were a third Bay of Pigs, it could happen. But it won't happen on my watch.
In October 1962, the U.S. and the USSR confronted each other over the Soviet installation of nuclear-armed missiles in Cuba. Nikita Khrushchev, leader of the USSR.
The Americans have surrounded our country with military bases in Turkey and threatened us with nuclear weapons. And now they will learn just what it feels like to have enemy missiles pointing at you.
This development of missiles is a deliberately provocative and unjustified change in the status quo which cannot be accepted by this country.
Kennedy's military advisors pressed for an invasion of Cuba.
but it's important to note that President Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev had already begun a secret correspondence in 1961 aimed at averting a nuclear catastrophe.
Khrushchev sent his first private letter to President Kennedy, wrapped in a newspaper, in September of 1961.
I like to compare our situation with Noah's Ark, where both the clean and the unclean found sanctuary. But regardless of who lists himself with the clean and who is considered to be unclean, they are equally interested in one thing, and that is that the Ark should successfully continue its cruise. And we have no other alternative. Either we live in peace and cooperation so that the Ark maintains its buoyancy, or else it sinks.
I like very much your analogy of Noah's Ark. Therefore, I'm trying to penetrate our ideological differences in order to find some bridge across the gulf on which we could bring our minds together and find some way in which to protect the peace of the world.
The arms race is ever growing, devouring the labors and the achievements of hundreds of millions of peoples, while the danger of a new war is increasing.
Wow, I never heard that before.
The President was leaning towards a blockade of further Soviet missile shipments, refusing to take the Joint Chiefs' advice to bomb and invade Cuba. When it looked as if nuclear war was imminent, Robert Kennedy looked at his brother, later described what he saw.
His hand went up to his face and covered his mouth. His face seemed drawn, his eyes pained, almost gray. Inexplicably, I thought of when he was ill and almost died, when he lost his child, when we learned that our oldest brother had been killed. Personal times of strain and hurt.
Robert Kennedy met privately with the Soviet ambassador, asking him to pass a message to Khrushchev.
The President is in a grave situation. We are under very severe stress. We are under pressure from our military to use force against Cuba. That is why the President is appealing directly to Chairman Khrushchev for his help in liquidating this conflict. If the situation continues much longer, the President is not sure that the military will not overthrow him and seize power.
An agreement was reached in back-channel negotiations between the two leaders. Khrushchev began removing the missiles. 6 months later, the U.S. took its missiles out of Turkey. General Curtis LeMay said, "It's the greatest defeat in our history. We should invade today. We had a chance to throw the communists out of Cuba, but the administration was scared to death the Russians might shoot a missile at us."
Scared to death? Thank God.
Then, on June 10th, 1963, at a commencement address at American University, Kennedy publicly challenged the very underpinnings of the Cold War.
I speak of peace because of the new face of war. Total war makes no sense in an age when the deadly poisons produced by nuclear exchange would be carried by wind and water and soil and seed to the far corners of the globe and to generations yet unborn. Let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and the means by which those differences can be resolved.
The pressure on Kennedy continued. Kennedy's Joint Chiefs pushed the President to pursue the Cold War in Latin America. Here's President Kennedy.
We can't embrace every tin-horn dictator who tells us he's anti-communist while he's sitting on the necks of his own people. And the United States government is not the representative of private business. There's a revolution going on down there, and I want to be on the right side of it. Hell, we are on the right side, but we have to let them know it, that things have changed.
Whoa.
And Kennedy got pressured to pursue the Cold War in Southeast Asia, too. Admiral Arleigh Burke, Army General George Decker, General Lyman Lemonster, and JFK.
We have to be prepared somewhere in Southeast Asia to throw in enough to win the works.
If we go in, we should go in to win. And that means bombing Hanoi, China, and maybe even using nuclear weapons.
If we are given the right to use nuclear weapons, we can guarantee victory.
These people are crazy. General MacArthur said that the chickens are coming home to roost from the Eisenhower years, and I live in the chicken coop.
In Vietnam, they suggested a nuclear strike and kept pushing for combat troops.
And didn't you mention something about CIA plot to assassinate their president?
Right. President Diem of South Vietnam, JFK said,
I've got to do something about those CIA bastards.
He did? What did he do?
in October 1963, he issued National Security Action Memorandum 263, authorizing
the withdrawal from Vietnam of 1,000 U.S. military personnel by the end of 1963, and by the end of 1965, the bulk of U.S. personnel.
So if JFK had lived, there wouldn't have been a Vietnam War? That's 50,000 American lives lost.
58,000 and over 3 million Vietnamese.
A month before going to Dallas, President Kennedy decided to create his own back channel to communicate with Fidel Castro, just as he had done with Nikita Khrushchev.
With Castro?
Kennedy's envoy, French journalist Jean Daniel of the socialist newsweekly Le Observateur, reported Kennedy's message later in a New Republic article.
I believe that there is no country in the world, including any and all countries under colonial domination, where economic colonization, humiliation, and exploitation were worse than in Cuba, in part owing to my country's policies. In that matter, I am in agreement with the first Cuban revolutionaries.
Well, what did Castro say?
I cannot help hoping that Kennedy will be willing to brave unpopularity, fight the trust, tell the truth, and most important, let the various nations act as they see fit.
Fidel Castro met with President Kennedy's envoy on November 20th, 1963. Castro?
Kennedy still has the possibility of becoming, in the eyes of history, the greatest president of the United States, the leader who made last understand that there can be coexistence between capitalists and socialists, even in the Americas. He would then be an even greater president than Lincoln. I know that for Khrushchev, Kennedy is a man you can talk with.
The next day, November 21st, Kennedy boarded Air Force One for Texas and Dallas.
Thomas Merton.
What the politicians don't have, depth, humanity, and a certain totality of self-forgetfulness and compassion, a deeper kind of dedication. Maybe Kennedy will break through into that someday. But such persons are before long marked out for assassination.
Then if there is a third Bay of Pigs,
It could happen. My friends, I feel like I'm in a dream. I'm on a train this time, and I can't find the conductor. There are rumors that the engineer is dead. I want to get out of my seat, but I can't move. The train is rocking and roaring. It's moving very fast.
A year after his forces came to power in Cuba, Castro and his delegation came to New York to attend the United Nations for the first time. Historian Joy James.
The United States State Department pressured the Shelburne Hotel on Lexington Avenue to cancel its contract for accommodations to the Cuban delegation.
The State Department? Why?
Castro had just successfully waged a revolution for independence within the U.S. sphere of influence.
Huh?
After the revolution, the United States stopped exporting oil to Cuba. When the Soviet Union sent crude oil to Cuba, the American-owned oil refineries there refused to refine it. So Castro nationalized the refineries.
So the hotel canceled the Cubans' reservations on their first visit to the U.S.?
Fidel Castro.
We faced two alternatives. One was the United Nations garden. When I mentioned this to the Secretary General, he was horrified at the thought of delegations in the tents there. But when we received Malcolm X's offer, I said, that is the place, the Hotel Teresa. I always recall my meeting with Malcolm X because he was the one who supported us and made it possible for us to stay there.
From the New York Citizen Call, September 1960.
Some 2,000 brown New Yorkers stood in the rain Monday night, waiting for Cuba's President Fidel Castro to arrive at Harlem's famous old Hotel Teresa, because he had found out, as most Negroes found out, the nasty ways the underdog was treated downtown.
Malcolm X.
Fidel Castro achieved a psychological coup over the U.S. State Department, who never dreamed he'd stay uptown in Harlem and make such an impression among the Negroes.
To Harlem's oppressed ghetto dwellers, Castro was that bearded revolutionary who had thrown the nation's rascal out and who had told white America to go to hell.
The Black Revolution is sweeping Asia, it's sweeping Africa, it's rearing its head in Latin America. The Cuban Revolution, that's a revolution. They overturned the system.
and here's what Martin Luther King was saying.
The nation of Asia and Africa are moving with jet-like speed towards gaining political independence, but we still creep at horse and buggy pace toward gaining a cup of coffee at a lunch counter.
FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover.
There are clear and unmistakable signs that we are in the midst of a social revolution with the racial movement at its core.
Mass civil disorders as a new stage of struggle can transmute the deep rage of ghetto into constructive and creative force. To dislocate the functioning of the city without destroying it can be more effective than a riot.
But back to Malcolm. Malcolm X's influence over large numbers of American blacks first came through his leadership within Elijah Muhammad's Nation of Islam movement. Alex Haley, co-author of the autobiography of Malcolm X.
Malcolm X said that he had increased the Nation of Islam membership from about 400 when he had joined to around 40,000.
Malcolm's message:
Let the black people patronize their own kind, hire their own kind, and start in those ways to build up the black race's ability to do for itself.
In 1957, Malcolm led over 100 Nation of Islam members to a Harlem police station where a Muslim who had tried to stop a police beating was being held. After the man was released, and Malcolm arranged for medical treatment for the man's injuries from the police mistreatment, Malcolm dispersed his group. Police said,
No man should have that much power. Anyone who could turn off a riot and probably start one.
Jeez. As long as the white man sent you to Korea, you bled. He sent you to Germany, you bled. He sent you to the South Pacific to fight the Japanese, you bled. You bleed for white people, but when it comes to seeing your own churches being bombed and little black girls murdered, you haven't got any blood. You bleed when the white man says bleed. You bite when the white man says bite, and you bark when the white man says bark.
What about Martin Luther King?
Well, perhaps it's easy for those who never felt the stinging darts of segregation to say, wait. But when you have seen vicious mobs lynch your mother and father and have been hate-filled police curse, kick, and even kill your black brothers and sisters, when you see the vast majority of your 20 million Negro brothers smothering in a airtight cage poverty of the midst of society, and you will understand why it is difficult to wait.
Coretta Scott King.
Nearly 1,000 cities became engulfed in protest against segregation. This encouraged us to join in organizing a march on Washington to dramatize the need for new federal legislation to integrate blacks completely into American society. On August 28, 1963, we participated in a mass rally with 250,000 people who had traveled from all over the country to Washington, D.C. Martin delivered his I Have a Dream speech from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial.
Americans have given its colored people a bad check, a check that has came back marked insufficient funds. But we refuse to believe that Bank of Justice is bankrupt, so we have come to cash this check, a check that will get us upon the riches and the freedom of security of a justice. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out its true meaning of the creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal.
Malcolm X responded to the March on Washington by saying,
They controlled it so tight they told those Negroes what time to hit time, how to come, where to step, what signs to carry, what song to sing, what speech they could make, and what speech they couldn't make. And then told them to get out of town by sundown. And every one of them Toms was out of town.
J. Edgar Hoover.
We wouldn't have any problems if we could get those two guys fighting. If we could get them to kill one another off.
No way. He said that?
Somewhere we must be able to stand before our most bitter components and say, we shall match your capacity to inflict suffering by our capacity to endure suffering. We will meet your physical force and soul force. Do to us what you will, and we will still love you.
You don't have to have a turn the other cheek revolution. Anytime a shepherd, a pastor teaches you and me not to run from the white man and at the same time teaches us not to fight the white man, he's a traitor to you and me.
Elijah Muhammad movement is one of the bitterest and more hated, and it comes very close to advocating violence. It is made up of people who have concluded that the white man is a devil.
Be peaceful, be courteous, obey the law, respect everyone. But if someone puts his hands on you, send him to the cemetery. That's that old-time religion, an eye for an eye.
The old law of eye for an eye leaves everybody blind.
Where was the president? Or he just consumed with splitting up the CIA?
In June 1963, President Kennedy had sent in National Guardsmen to force Governor Wallace to integrate Alabama schools. In his June 11th speech on civil rights, the first time a president had addressed the topic since Lincoln, Kennedy publicly promised action.
Difficulties over segregation and discrimination exist in every city, in every state of the Union, producing in many cities a rising tide of discontent that threatens the public safety. We face, therefore, a moral crisis as a country and a people. It cannot be met by repressive police action. It cannot be quieted by token moves or talk. It is a time to act in the Congress and in all our daily lives.
NAACP official Medgar Evers was killed the night of Kennedy's speech. The FBI had done surveillance on black leaders almost since it began in the 1920s. But under Hoover, in the 1950s and 60s, black leaders were targeted under a program called COINTELPRO, an acronym for Counterintelligence Program. From an FBI memo,
For maximum effectiveness of the Counterintelligence Program's Racial Intelligence Division, long-range goals are: 1. Prevent the coalition of militant black nationalist groups. 2. Prevent militant black nationalist groups and leaders from gaining respectability by discrediting them.
they did surveillance, burglary, and blackmail, trying to infiltrate, discredit, and disrupt domestic political organizations.
And 3. Prevent the rise of a messiah who could unify, electrify, and help the militant black nationalist movement.
And Malcolm was just that. From an FBI memo written by the special agent in charge of the FBI's Chicago office,
over the years, considerable thought has been given and action taken with the Bureau's approval, relating to methods through which the Nation of Islam could be discredited in the eyes of the general black populace, or through which factionalism among the leadership could be created, the most notable being Malcolm X.
they tried to drive a wedge between Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam, led by Elijah Muhammad. Wallace Muhammad, Muhammad's son.
The FBI had key persons in the Nation of Islam national staff, at least 1 or 2 maybe. I believe that the members of the Nation of Islam were influenced to do the things that they did against Malcolm, not just by the national staff and my father, but also by the intelligence department.
There had been rumors that Elijah Muhammad had conceived children with several of his secretaries. In 1962, the FBI approved a scheme where phony letters on Elijah's philandering with his secretaries would be mailed to Elijah's wife and others. William Sullivan, FBI head of intelligence.
These letters should be mailed at staggered intervals using care to prevent any possibility of tracing the mailing back to the FBI.
The FBI letters did fool Elijah, who believed that Malcolm had written them. Malcolm X was silenced by Elijah Muhammad and removed from leadership positions.
On March 8, 1964, Malcolm X announced his departure from the Nation of Islam, saying it had gone as far as it could. He said he was prepared to cooperate in local civil rights actions in the South and elsewhere.
As of this minute, I've forgotten everything bad that other leaders have said about me. And I pray that they can also forget the many bad things I've said about them.
Right on.
Malcolm and Martin met for the first and only time in the nation's capital on March 26, 1964. They had both been listening to the Senate's debate on civil rights legislation. Afterwards, they spoke together and were interviewed.
If their Senate keeps on talking and doing nothing, a creative, direct action program will start. If the Civil Rights Act is not passed, our nation is in for a dark night of social destruction.
And I'm here to remind the white man of the alternative to Dr. King.
And they shook hands warmly.
I must have given Hoover the absolute willies.
It wasn't just the handshake that did that.
When you expand the civil rights struggle to the level of human rights, you can take Uncle Sam before a world court.
Malcolm wasn't neutralized. In fact, he was turning to the world stage. And his political and spiritual world had expanded in April 1964 with his pilgrimage to Mecca.
During the last 11 days, I've eaten from the same plate, slept on the same rug while praying to the same God with fellow Muslims, whose eyes were the bluest of blue, whose hair was the blondest of blonde, and whose skin was the whitest of white. I felt in them the same sincerity that I felt among the black African Muslims. Perhaps American whites can be cured of the rampant racism which is consuming them. In all honesty and sincerity, I wish nothing but freedom, justice, and equality for all people.
Malcolm traveled extensively and met with most African leaders. Many of them received him like a head of state.
We stand defenseless at the mercy of American racists who murder us at will for no reason other than we are black and of African descent. It is not a problem of civil rights, but a problem of human rights. What makes our African brothers hesitate to bring the United States government before the World United Nations and charge her with violating the human rights of 22 million African Americans?
As the New York Times reported,
The African move profoundly disturbed the American authorities, who gave the impression that they had been caught off guard.
from a New York Times article written in Washington on August 13, 1964.
Washington's officials said that if Malcolm succeeded in convincing just one African government to bring up the charge at the United Nations, the United States government would find itself in the same category as South Africa, Hungary, and other countries whose domestic politics have become debating issues at the United Nations.
So let me guess, the stakes got higher.
Malcolm X?
I was having dinner at the Nile Hilton in Cairo. I felt a pain in my stomach, and in a flash, I realized that I'd seen the waiter who served me before. At the hospital, the doctor said that there was a toxic substance in my food. When the Egyptians who were with me looked for the waiter who had served me, he had vanished. I know that our Muslims don't have the resources to finance a worldwide spy network.
So he originally thought it was the Nation of Islam people who were against him?
Right. But Malcolm's travels abroad were tracked by practically the entire U.S. intelligence establishment. On February 4th, 1965, J. Edgar Hoover sent a memo to
CIA Director, CIA Deputy Director of Plans.
Who?
The CIA officer in charge of Cold War's assassinations.
Army Assistant Chief of Staff for Intelligence, Director of Naval Intelligence, Chief of the Air Force Counterintelligence Division,
and offices in London and Paris whose names were so sensitive that they were deleted from the document.
So he's got the CIA and the whole military against him now.
The report detailed Malcolm's travel plans for his upcoming trip to England and France.
On February 9th, 5 days after Hoover's memo detailing his travel plans, Malcolm arrived in Paris. French police surrounded him at the airport, and he was barred from entering the country.
Had he ever been there before?
Just 3 months before, without a problem.
So what happened?
A journalist who investigated Malcolm's death, Eric Norden, was given an answer to the French puzzle in April 1965. A highly placed North African diplomat who insisted upon anonymity said that his country's intelligence apparatus had been quietly informed by the French that the CIA planned Malcolm's murder, and France feared it would happen on their soil.
The French were warning the diplomat that if Malcolm came to his country, the CIA might kill him there.
After every one of my trips abroad, America's rulers see me as being more and more dangerous. That's why I feel in my bones the plots to kill me have already been hatched in high places.
On Sunday, February 14th, 1965, as Malcolm and his family were sleeping, his house was firebombed. Bottles of gasoline with fuses had been thrown through the front window, setting the house on fire. Malcolm, his wife Betty, who was 6 months pregnant with twins, and their 4 daughters escaped through the kitchen door.
2 days after the firebombing, police detectives who were investigating it told the media that a whiskey bottle containing gasoline had been found intact and upright on top of the baby dresser in the house. An African-American fire marshal, Vincent Canty, later told Malcolm that a fireman had set the bottle of gasoline there.
On Monday, February 15th, Malcolm gave a speech to 700 people at the Audubon Ballroom. Malcolm told his friend, life photographer Gordon Parks,
It's a time for martyrs now. And if I'm to be one, it will be in the cause of brotherhood. That's the only thing that can save this country now.
Malcolm wasn't the only one willing to face martyrdom. Let's pick up Martin Luther King's story. 1964, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize.
I feel as though this prize has been given to me for something that really has not yet been achieved. It is a commission to go out and work even harder for the things in which we believe.
But Hoover had a different point of view.
King was the last one in the world who should have received it.
William Sullivan, FBI head of intelligence.
Hoover told me he felt that King was or could become a serious threat to the security of the country. He pointed out that King was an instrument of the Communist Party, and he wanted to prove that King had a relationship with the Soviet bloc.
Hoover.
I kept saying that Castro was a communist, and you people wouldn't believe me. Now you're saying King is not a communist, and you're just as wrong this time as you were with Castro.
1964, King told an audience in Jackson, Mississippi.
Sick and tired of people saying this movement has been infiltrated by communists. There are as many communists in this freedom movement as there is Eskimos in Florida.
Later, in 1976, the FBI admitted that they had no evidence of King's involvement in communist organizations.
At the bottom, Hoover was concerned about King's repeated criticism of the FBI and its alleged lack of interest in the civil rights movement.
According to King, the FBI, under the direction of Hoover,
was followed in path of appeasement of political powers in the South. If this continues, the reign of terror in Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia will increase rather than subside.
Hoover went out after him with his biggest guns. Hoover instructed us that tapes made in King's hotel rooms were to be made available to some members of the press, to some select congressmen, and to President Johnson. He even sent derogatory information about King to the Pope prior to King's visit to Rome for a papal audience.
You're kidding.
Hoover wanted some excerpts of the tape sent to King's wife, Coretta. Enclosed in a box with the tape was an unsigned note to Dr. King.
The American public, the church organizations that have been helping will know you for who you are. You are done. There is only one way out for you. You better take it before your filthy, abnormal, fraudulent self is bared to the nation.
How could he do that? It's just so...
Martin and Malcolm came to have similar views on war.
If violence is wrong in America, violence is wrong abroad. If it's wrong to be violent defending black women and black children and black babies and black men, then it is wrong for America to draft us and make us violent abroad in defense of her.
From Martin Luther King's landmark Beyond Vietnam speech at the Riverside Church in 1967.
We were taking the black young men who had been crippled by our society and sending them 8,000 miles away, guaranteed liberties in Southeast Asia, which they had not found in Southwest Georgia and East Harlem. I could never again raise my voice against the violence of the oppressed in the ghetto without having first spoken clearly to the greatest purveyors of violence in the world today, my own government.
Malcolm and Martin came to have similar views about fighting for human rights also.
We have moved from the era of civil rights to an era of human rights.
Yow. If these two guys together, Hoover's nightmare. I wonder what that might have been like. A Baptist and a Muslim.
Both Malcolm and Martin went beyond racial justice to address the need for economic justice. Malcolm X.
The masses of our people still have bad housing, bad schooling, and inferior jobs. The administration only gave us tokenism. Tokenism never benefits the masses.
Martin Luther King began organizing the Poor People's Campaign, an effort to create an economic Bill of Rights for the poor.
We ought to come in on mule carts, come to Washington, sit down, if necessary, in the middle of the streets.
The Poor People's Campaign will bring together Appalachian whites, Mexican Americans, Native Americans, African Americans, all coming to the steps of the nation's capital.
After we get to D.C. and stay a few days, we'll call the peace movement in and let them go on the other side of the river and try to close down the Pentagon if that can be done.
It is anybody's guess who might personally meet a fatal catastrophe first. Nonviolent Dr. King or so-called violent me.
Things can't keep going on like this.
No, it's drawing to a close. On April 3, 1968, Martin Luther King arrived in Memphis for a second march in support of the striking sanitation workers, an action in line with his goals for the Poor People's Campaign. Coretta Scott King.
The morning that he was to come back to Memphis that second time, which was the final time, his plane was delayed because of threats that had come to him.
Although the Lorraine Hotel posed security problems, those making King's arrangements booked him there. On the night before King's arrival in Memphis, an unidentified male member of King's staff phoned the hotel and insisted that King's room be changed to an outside balcony room completely exposed to public view. On the evening he arrived in Memphis, the night before he was shot, King told a crowd of sanitation workers,
I don't know what would happen now. We got some difficult days ahead of us. Like anybody, I would like to live long life. Longevity has its place, but it really doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop, I've seen the promised land, and may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we, as the people, will get to the promised land.
Kennedy had planned his trip to Dallas as part of a difficult re-election campaign. An advisor called Dallas a dangerous place, but Kennedy was undeterred. Speaking to his wife, Jackie Kennedy, on their way to Dallas.
Jackie, if somebody wants to shoot me from a window with a rifle, nobody can stop it, so why worry about it?
the morning of his assassination, Malcolm spoke on the phone with his sister Ella in Boston. His last words to her were,
You pray for me, Ella, because I firmly believe now I need it more than I've ever needed it before. So you ask Allah to guide me, because I feel they may have me doomed for this day. Yes, this day.
On the morning of November 22nd, 1963, President Kennedy arrived in Dallas and rode through the jubilant streets in his motorcade.
On April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King, still preparing for the march in Memphis, went out on the balcony of the Lorraine Hotel dressed for dinner. On February 21st, 1965, Malcolm arrived at the Audubon Ballroom in Manhattan.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm only going to talk to you just for a minute or so this evening because I have some very sad news for all of you, and I think sad news for all of our fellow citizens and people who love peace all over the world. And that is that Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis. First the French and then the United States have been predicting victory in Vietnam. In 1961 and in 1962, as well as 1966 and 1967, we have been told that the tide is turning. There is a light at the end of the tunnel. We can soon bring our troops home. Victory is near. The enemy is tiring. Once in 1962, I participated in such a prediction myself. But for 20 years, we have been wrong. The history of conflict among nations does not record another such lengthy and consistent chronicle of error as we have shown in Vietnam. It is time to discard so proven a fallacy and face the reality that a military victory is not in sight and that it will probably never come.
My friends, here we are again. I feel like I'm a pebble, hard, round, small, and I've been dropped in a well. The well is deep. I just keep falling. There's no bottom. The grief is deep, and I'm drowning. And then I panic. I puff up with lies, and I rise to the surface. I just want to wake up. You know what I mean? Yes.
Robert Kennedy had served as Attorney General in his brother JFK's administration, and then became United States Senator for New York in 1965. Then, in early 1968,
I am announcing my candidacy for the presidency of the United States. I run to seek new policies. Policies to end the bloodshed in Vietnam and in our cities. Policies to close the gaps that now exist between black and white, rich and poor, young and old in this country and around the rest of the world. I run because it is now unmistakably clear that we can change these disastrous, divisive policies only by changing the men who make them.
he became a leading candidate for the Democratic Party's presidential nomination. On the campaign trail, Bobby Kennedy met with farm workers, students, people of color, and the poor.
I have now listened to young people in our nation and felt their anger about the war they are sent to fight and the world they are about to inherit. I have seen inexcusable and ugly deprivation which causes children to starve in Mississippi, black citizens to riot in Watts, young Indians to commit suicide on their reservations because they've lacked all hope and they feel they have no future, and proud and able-bodied families to wait out their lives in empty idleness in eastern Kentucky.
He opposed the war in Vietnam.
I run for the presidency because I want the United States of America to stand for hope instead of despair, for reconciliation instead of the growing risk of world war.
But Robert Kennedy had few friends within the upper reaches of the FBI and the CIA. Those agencies remembered his role in supporting his brother's policies. At an FBI meeting held when RFK's campaign began, Hoover's assistant, Clyde Tolson,
I hope that someone shoots and kills the son of a bitch.
Bobby Kennedy told journalist Pete Hummel,
I have to decide whether to eliminate the operation arm of the CIA or what the hell to do with it. We can't have those cowboys wandering around and shooting people and doing all these unauthorized things.
Jesus, here we go again. Were there any investigations into the murders of Malcolm and Martin and JFK?
Yes, they said lone nuts or black brothers killed them all, no involvement from anyone else, no conspiracies.
For example, the official story is that Malcolm X was killed by Talmadge Hayer, Norman 3X Butler, and Thomas 15X Johnson as a result of a division between Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam.
Wait, what about the poisoning and the thing in Paris?
Exactly. Besides that, many eyewitnesses described 3 shooters and 2 co-conspirators in the ballroom the day Malcolm X was killed.
Only one of those shooters was caught, Talmadge Hayer, who confessed and was convicted. The other 4 left the scene. Johnson and Butler were arrested a week later, and they were convicted. But they denied having been in the ballroom, and hundreds of witnesses said the same thing.
So 3 people went to jail, but only one of them was actually involved? What about the other shooters?
Never charged or even investigated.
And then there was the official story about President Kennedy's assassination from the Warren Commission report.
The shots which killed President Kennedy were fired from the 6th floor window of the Texas School Book Depository. The Commission has found no evidence of any conspiracy to assassinate President Kennedy.
The Texas School Book Depository was behind the president in the motorcade. If the official story were true, the bullets would have entered President Kennedy from the back. Dr. Charles Crenshaw was on duty at Parkland Memorial, where the president was first taken.
I noticed a small opening in the midline of his throat, a bullet entry wound. There was no doubt in my mind about that wound, as I had seen dozens of them in the emergency room.
21 of 22 witnesses at Parkland Hospital, most of them doctors and nurses, trained medical observers, agreed in their earliest statements that JFK's massive head wound was located in the right rear of his skull, demonstrating a fatal head wound from the front.
From the damage I saw, there was no doubt in my mind that the bullet had entered his head through the front.
Allen Dulles, former head of the CIA, was appointed to the Warren Commission.
We need to deal with a great many of the false rumors that have been spread on the basis of false interpretation of these Parkland doctors' appearances before the television and the radio and so forth.
Allen Dulles was on the Warren Commission? The same Allen Dulles?
He was.
And what about Robert Kennedy? Did he buy the official report?
He supported it in public. But in 2013, his son, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., said,
In private, he was dismissive of it. My father believed the report was a shoddy piece of craftsmanship.
Adrian Rich, poet and feminist.
Whatever is unnamed, whatever is misnamed as something else, whatever is buried under an inadequate or lying language, this will become not merely unspoken, but unspeakable.
Robert Kennedy had won 6 Democratic primaries before winning the California vote on June 4th, 1968. He made a victory speech for supporters at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles after the announcement of his win. Nina Rhodes eyewitnessed at the hotel.
As he finished his speech, I went to greet him, and this tall blonde man in a tuxedo whisked him in the other direction, so they're heading toward the kitchen. I said, no, you're going the wrong way. And then, people are falling, they're sliding down the wall, ducking. Then I look down, and I see the senators falling, and I'm screaming, oh my God, no! It was like, not again, not again. Not only was it a heartbreaking experience, all my hopes were dashed about what he could do for the country.
Who shot him?
The official story, Sirhan Sirhan, a Palestinian-born Jordanian, was convicted of the crime.
Another lone nut, I suppose.
Here's Paul Schrade, Robert Kennedy's close associate, who was severely wounded in the shooting.
You don't need anything but the clear-cut evidence to prove that Sirhan wasn't a lone gunman, as the LAPD contends.
As The Guardian reported on February 22, 2008, acoustic forensic expert Philip von Prague concluded,
It is possible to make out 13 shots. That is more than 8 rounds that Sirhan's revolver carried. Also, there are 2 pairs of double shots that occurred so close together, it is inconceivable that Sirhan could have fired them all.
13 shots from a gun that could only fire 8.
And then there's the issue of the distance between the gun and the wounds. A year after Sirhan's trial, William W. Harper reviewed the ballistic evidence and found that Robert Kennedy was fired upon from 2 distinct firing positions.
there are lots of issues with the official stories, but for today, just one other example. Let's look at the autopsy of President Kennedy. Remember how Dr. Crenshaw thought the shot in the neck was an entrance wound?
Yes.
Just after the assassination, the Secret Service took control of the body. But Dallas coroner Earl Rose resisted them, saying that Texas law and the chain of evidence required him to perform an autopsy before the body left Parkland Hospital in Dallas. The Secret Service pushed ahead with the coffin. Rose stood aside.
The president's body was flown from Dallas to the Bethesda Naval Hospital in Maryland. On the afternoon of the assassination, Dr. Robert B. Livingston, scientific director for 2 of the National Institutes of Health, placed a call to Dr. Humes, the head of the autopsy team at Bethesda. Dr. Livingston.
I said that if that wound were confirmed as a wound of entrance from in front of the president, there had to have been more than one gunman. At just that moment, there was an interruption in our conversation. Dr. Humes returned after a pause to say, Dr. Livingston, I'm sorry, but I can't talk with you any longer. The FBI won't let me.
Lieutenant Colonel Pierre Fink was the Army doctor who assisted Dr. Humes in the autopsy. Colonel Fink was questioned under oath about the president's autopsy.
Was Dr. Humes running the show?
Well, I heard Dr. Humes say, who is in charge here? And I heard an Army general, I don't remember his name, stating, I am.
How many other military personnel were present in the autopsy room?
Well, the room was crowded with military and civilian personnel and federal agents, Secret Service agents, FBI agents.
Navy Medical Corpsman Paul O'Connor was also in the autopsy room.
It got very tense. Admiral Galloway started getting very agitated about the wound in his neck, and I remember the doctor was going to check it out, but Admiral Galloway told him, leave it alone, don't touch it. It's just a tracheotomy. He stopped anybody from going further. Dr. Humes and Bowles, Dr. Finch, were told to leave it alone.
Dr. Fink refused to answer several questions related to the track of the bullet in President Kennedy's neck.
I will ask you the question one more time. Why did you not dissect the track of the bullet wound that you have described today and you saw at the time of the autopsy, at the time you examined the body?
As I recall, I was told not to, but I don't remember by whom.
James Jenkins, who also assisted in the autopsy, confirmed that the doctors were obeying military orders.
In retrospect, I think doing the autopsy in Bethesda rather than at Parkland Hospital in Dallas was a controlling factor. They could control Humes, Boswell, and Fink because they were military. And if we weren't controlled, we could be punished, and that kept us away from the public. From that point on, I have had no trust, no respect for the government.
Charles Crenshaw, Parkland Hospital doctor.
There was a conspiracy of silence. I believe there was a common denominator in our silence. a fearful perception that to come forward with what we believed to be the medical truth would be asking for trouble. Although we never admitted it to one another, we realized that the inertia of the established story was so powerful, so thoroughly presented, so adamantly accepted, that it would bury anyone who stood in its path. I was as afraid of the men in suits as I was of the men who had assassinated the president. I reasoned that anyone who would go so far as to eliminate the president of the United States would surely not hesitate to kill a doctor.
Hold on. What was the rest of that email? Also learn, if you doubt us, how wrong your fear is being. Write I doubt you in subject line. Resend extra gift. No money. Rumors are spreading too badly to make safety for everyone. Your last worry is our concern. Please ignore warnings from imitators who tell you lies. Only madmen, bad men, kill them alone.
Police and security forces were pulled back from their protective duties for all 4 leaders. The evidence and investigations were mishandled in all 4 cases.
For example, the official story was that James Earl Ray shot Martin Luther King from a rooming house window in Memphis. But the area behind the rooming house is where multiple eyewitnesses thought the shots that killed Martin Luther King had come from. Here's what happened the next morning. Maynard Stiles, Memphis Director of Public Works Sanitation Services,
I received a call from Memphis Police Inspector Sam Evans on or about 7 a.m. requesting assistance in clearing brush and debris from a vacant lot in the vicinity of the assassination. A crew went to that site and proceeded with the cleanup.
Destroying the crime scene.
you got it. Journalist and author Jim Nares, in his book Crossfire, lists over 100 names of potential witnesses to JFK's assassination who died or were killed, many of them under suspicious circumstances.
100 witnesses? 100?
It's not just the investigations and witnesses.
You already told me about everyone tracking Malcolm X and the incidents overseas, and the FBI and Martin Luther King.
There's Lloyd Jowers, a former Memphis police officer. Jowers was the owner of a restaurant across the street from where King was shot. He had a relationship with Frank Liberto, who Jowers described as a mafia operative. From an ABC News Primetime Live December 1993 interview with Sam Donaldson.
Were you involved in this conspiracy to kill Martin Luther King, Jr.?
I was involved in it indirectly. Liberto had done me a large favor. I owed him a favor.
What did Frank Liberto ask you to do?
He asked me to handle some money transactions, hire someone to assassinate Dr. Martin Luther King.
Kill Dr. King?
Yes, sir. He asked me if I know someone. I told him I thought I knew someone who would probably do it.
And he gave you some money?
Large amount of money. Yes, sir. Delivered it to the cafe.
Did he talk about the police?
Liberto? Yes, sir. He said they wouldn't be there. Said they wouldn't be there that night.
Did he say there would be a decoy there?
Yes, sir. Said he had set it up where it looked like somebody else did the killing.
Enter James Earl Ray.
Was he part of the conspiracy?
Oops.
He was part of it, but I don't believe he knew he was part of it.
Well, Mr. Jowers, did you find someone to do the killing?
Yes, sir.
That was on TV?
That's not all Jowers said about King's assassination. In taped interviews with his attorney, Jowers confirmed that planning sessions for the assassination had taken place in his bar and grill across the street from the Lorraine Hotel.
Those meetings included at least 2 Memphis Police Department officials and 1 or 2 men Jowers thought were CIA or FBI. They also included Merrill McCullough.
I saw him several times, sure. He was plain clothes whenever he could come in. but he come in with the Memphis police.
William Pepper investigated McCullough.
Merrill McCullough had been in the regular army up to December 1966. Then in June 1967, he was reactivated and hired as a military intelligence informant.
Reporter Mark Parasquia.
The FBI arranged McCullough's placement in the Memphis Police Department's intelligence squad.
Wait, this guy was military intelligence, assigned to the local police and put there by the FBI?
McCullough admitted to subsequently being involved as an agent provocateur in a number of illegal activities for which various black militants were convicted and sentenced.
And in 1974, where do you think he got his next job?
You're not going to tell me the CIA.
Exactly. But testifying before the House Select Committee on Assassinations, here's what McCullough said.
At any time through the period of the assassination, did you have any relationship with the FBI?
No, sir. I was solely responsible to the police department.
Did you have any relationship with any other intelligence agency?
No, sir.
At the time of King's assassination, his is the figure bending over Dr. King.
You might remember another story of a black officer who infiltrated the inner circle of a black leader, Gene Roberts.
He was on Malcolm's security detail, tried to tell his supervisors about the dry run, right?
Right, yes. Speaking of Malcolm X, Roberts said to a reporter in the 1980s,
I think he was a good person. I learned to love the man, respect him.
Wow, change of heart.
when Malcolm was shot, Gene Roberts went up on the stage and gave Malcolm mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. He tried to revive him. During the debrief afterwards, his police bosses asked him,
"What did you do that for?"
Well, I'm a cop, and this is what cops are supposed to do, save people.
My friends, I'm trapped in a maze. Untruths, half-truths, hidden truths, deleted truths, denied truths, truths repaid by death. Suspicious deaths, designer deaths, by poison, by shooting, by electrocution, in public, in private. To dare to speak the truth means to invite assassination. So I put my head down. I doubt. I water the plants. I pay the bills. I drink the Kool-Aid complicity, the medicine of slaves. I say, how can I be sure? I don't have the time. There's nothing I can do. The world curdles. I look around at my friends. We try to smile as we mutter the sweet phrases, the creed of a democracy we no longer believe in. Who am I in this maze of lies? Like Hansel and Gretel, my breadcrumbs have been picked clean, and I lose the way to myself. So I follow directions, stay between the lines, I stop at the corners, teach my children to cooperate. I call it a privilege to take up the tokens on this cold, dark road that leads nowhere. One word could bring down these lies. One word spoken freely in public. One word that is the truth. One word that I bury in the boneyard of the unspeakable.
President John F. Kennedy.
The great enemy of the truth is often not the lie, deliberate, contrived, and dishonest, but the myth, persistent, persuasive, and unrealistic.
William Schaff, lawyer, author, and journalist, testifying under oath with William Pepper.
Disinformation is very, very effective over time. The longer that you can control the spin on a story, the more that spin becomes accepted as the absolute truth. For 30 years, the official line has been that James Earl Ray killed Martin Luther King, and he did it all by himself. If somebody stood up and confessed and said, "I did it, here's a movie showing me do it," 99% of the people wouldn't believe it, because it just wouldn't click in the mind.
Can you give us some idea of the influence that the CIA and the FBI have had over the media?
The Church Committee,
That's the Senate committee that looked into illegal intelligence gathering activities in 1975.
the Church Committee reported that the CIA had thousands of journalists in their employ. They also owned outright, the CIA, about 250 or more media organizations, the wire services, newspapers, magazines, radio, television stations. The actual shareholder of the company turned out to be some CIA front. Every single city of any size on earth had some employee and that they could get the stories anywhere.
Incredible.
And there are ways to make sure stories don't come out. Dorothy Kilgallen became the first nationally known journalist to raise critical questions about the JFK assassination and the government cover-up. She printed story after story of witnesses who had been threatened by the Dallas police or the FBI.
Intelligence agencies will be watching us. We'll have to be very careful. But if it's the last thing I do, I'm going to break this case. This story isn't going to die as long as there's a real reporter alive. And there are a lot of them.
Dorothy Kilgallen died on November 8, 1965, in her Manhattan bedroom from a lethal dose of secobarbital, amobarbital, and pentobarbital. Quinine, which might have covered the bitter taste of the barbiturates, was found in her brain, bile, and liver. That fact, however, was not reported in the official laboratory findings presented to the Department of Pathology.
And it's not just control of the media by the intelligence community. Noam Chomsky, linguist and media critic.
The media serve the interests of state and corporate power, which are closely interlinked. They frame their reporting and analysis in a manner supportive of established privilege, and they limit debate and discussion accordingly.
Former New York Congressman Allard Lowenstein, a civil rights advocate who had pushed to reopen the Sirhan investigation.
It seems fair to say that there is now a rebuttal presumption that more than one assassination was involved in the RFK case. But what is even clearer is that nobody is making a serious effort to rebut that presumption. The notion seems to be that the presumption can be waited out, that unanswered questions will fade given time, and that the best way to deal with awkward new facts is to ignore them until they can be denounced as nothing new and then dismissed.
And here's Martin Schatz, psychiatrist and author.
That is what we mean by mass denial. The murder of the president is not a mystery. Any citizen who is willing to look can see clearly who killed President Kennedy and why.
But how could every single government official who must have known about this go along?
Daniel Ellsberg, prominent Vietnam War whistleblower.
I had signed many secrecy oaths over the years. All of them were blanket promises never to give out any classified information, even if it revealed evidence of official lies or crimes, even if countless people had died and were continuing to die because the information was being wrongfully withheld. The promise to keep secrets of state, once demanded and given, becomes virtually part of one's core identity, one's pride and self-respect.
Then what agency, what power carried out the Kennedy assassination? Or the others?
Colonel Fletcher Prouty, former head of Special Operations.
No agency played a role as an agency. I have worked on assassinations in other countries, or the removal from office of people from other countries. We called it the Gold Key Club. A certain small group coalesces and they are given an order to do something. For example, there was a program called Mongoose, whose objective was to remove Castro from office in Cuba. The people assigned to Mongoose were from various agencies and various countries working together. Some others who were not from any agencies. They were hired employees from other specialties and other businesses that are competent in this business of establishing coup d'etat and things like that.
Coup d'etat?
Gaetan Fonzi is a former federal investigator for the House Select Committee on Assassinations. In his book, The Last Investigation, Fonzi names those who he was convinced were involved.
A cabal of associates whose careers were entwined with the history of CIA assassination plots. But the House Select Committee on Assassinations did not want to confront the CIA or open doors that would force it to face facts that it did not want to face.
The unspeakable,
Jim Douglas.
the unspeakable is not far away. It is not somewhere out there. We U.S. citizens supported our government when it protected our Cold War security by world destructive weapons, and when it carried out the covert murders of foreign leaders with plausible deniability, and by avoiding our responsibility for the escalating crimes of state done for our security, we who failed to confront the unspeakable opened the door to JFK's assassination and its cover-up. The unspeakable is not far away.
Researcher Martin Schatz.
One of the primary means of mobilizing the American people politically today is to hold them in a state of confusion in which anything can be believed but nothing can be known. And the American people are more than willing to be held in this state because to know the truth is to face an awful terror and to be no longer able to evade responsibility. It is precisely in moving from belief to knowledge that the citizen moves from irresponsibility to responsibility, from helplessness and hopelessness to action.
David Grossman, author.
Better to hand over the job of thinking and doing and setting moral standards to those who are surely in the know. Better not to feel too much until the crisis ends. And if it never ends, at least we'll have suffered a little less, developed a useful dullness, protected ourselves as much as we could with a little indifference, a little repression, a little deliberate blindness, and a large dose of self-anesthetics.
Author James Baldwin.
Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced.
Now, from 1997, here's Leon Harris, a CNN anchor.
We want to take you live to Nashville, Tennessee, where Dexter King, the son of Martin Luther King Jr., is meeting with James Earl Ray, who is in prison for having killed Martin Luther King Jr.
I guess in some strange way, our destinies, that of my father's and yourself, somehow got tied up together. I felt it was important for me, myself personally, and on behalf of my family, to reach out firsthand. I just want to ask you, for the record, did you kill my father?
No, I didn't. No.
Well, as awkward as this may seem, I want you to know that I believe you, and my family believes you, and we're going to do everything in our power to try to make sure justice will prevail.
So what did you do?
We had a meeting with President Clinton, who questioned that we saw as a similar model to South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That request was not granted, but like anything that has not been resolved, it will haunt you until it's resolved.
1999, over 30 years after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., the King family initiated a wrongful death lawsuit against Lloyd Jowers and other unknown co-conspirators.
What was the verdict?
Here's the judge reading from the jury's unanimous findings.
In answer to the question, did Lloyd Jowers participate in a conspiracy to do harm to Dr. Martin Luther King? Your answer is
Yes.
You also find that others, including governmental agencies, were parties to this conspiracy as alleged by the defendant? Your answer to that one is also
Yes.
Dexter King.
The question now is, what will you do with that?
Hey, that's from my dream.
And this is President Carter.
America does not at the moment have a functioning democracy.
That is true. He really said that?
Just last year.
Why didn't I hear about it?
I was part of a German news magazine interview. The American press ignored it.
Certainly in death, my father can be martyred and put on a pedestal. But does America really want to deal with what he was fighting for? It is not about who killed Martin Luther King Jr. It's about why he was killed. Because if you answer the why, you will understand the same things are still happening. Until we address that, we're all in trouble.
Still happening?
Robert Reich, political economist and author.
There are two great centers of unaccountable power in the American political economic system today. Places where decisions that significantly affect large numbers of Americans are made in secret and are unchecked either by effective democratic oversight or by market competition. One goes by the name of Wall Street and is centered in the largest banks there. The second goes by the name of the intelligence community, and its epicenter is the National Security Agency within the Defense Department.
And RiseUp.net says,
Even in really large campaigns, there are often only a handful of people who are the connectors. Without them, communication, coalition, coordination, and solidarity will break down. With the NSA spying program, they can easily see who the bridge people are and who they need to target. Does that sound paranoid? Or are we at a point where nothing sounds paranoid anymore?
Maybe I am paranoid, or at least afraid. But like that doctor said, if they can kill a president, they can certainly kill me.
Thomas Merton.
One of the awful facts of our age is the evidence that the world is stricken to the very core of its being by the presence of the unspeakable.
So?
What?
What are you thinking?
Nothing. I'm just wondering what those four men would have said about all this.
Today there is a danger that illusion may prevent effective action.
I know that societies have often killed the people who have helped to change those societies.
A man who won't die for something is not fit to live.
There is a Chinese curse which says, "May he live in interesting times." Like it or not, we live in interesting times. They are times of danger and uncertainty, but they are also more open to creative energy.
I'm reminded of James Baldwin, poet activist, Audre Lorde.
The act is to be committed, and to be committed is to be in danger. Without the joyful accepting of this danger, there can never be any safety for anyone, ever, anywhere.
When we speak, we are afraid. But when we are silent, we are still afraid. So it is better to speak.
You know what's surprising?
What?
That all this, it's not that surprising. And whatever I'm feeling, it's better than feeling nothing.
Why is that?
It feels like a step forward. I'm glad you came. I've lived long enough to die a good death. May we all have the courage to live a good life.